Hello, I'm Fatima and welcome to my autoethnography on how my schooling has played an active role in constructing and reconstructing my views on race, culture, ethnic groups and indigenous people. I'm from a Lebanese cultural background and my religion is Islam. I was born and raised in Australia and grew up in the suburb of Bankstown, which is considered a low socio-economic region, home to a large population of Lebanese and Vietnamese people. I am the only child in my family. My family has always taught me to be inclusive of all and that no particular culture was superior to another. I was taught to be respectful and to treat others the way I would like to be treated. I always and up till now hold great respect to the elders of this land and the indigenous community. I attended Bankstown Public School and Bankstown Girls High School, which were both very multicultural and inclusive of all cultures, races, ethnic groups, and indigenous people. They held strong beliefs in including all humanity and aimed to provide equal education access to all. And here are some quotes from their websites on inclusiveness. My schooling and university education have played an active role in constructing and reconstructing my views on race, culture, ethnic backgrounds, and Indigenous people. During my primary schooling, I participated in a wide range of activities that were valued and represented multiculturalism. These included Harmony Day and Multicultural Day activities, where we encouraged to come dressed to school in our traditional cultural wear and to bring a dish with us that was significant to our cultural upbringing. This was a great way of learning about different cultures and ethnic groups. However, in my opinion, the enacted null and hidden curriculum in school developed the normalization of the white culture, that white was normal and any other culture was considered as the other, whether we noticed it or not. The education and the enacted curriculum in my schooling always focused on the idea that white American and Western cultures were successful. I remember in most of my subjects in secondary schooling, all the advertisements, movies, poems, and case studies that we were given to analyze depicted a typical white blonde hair and blue-eyed individual or a typically orientated family that is a husband, wife, one girl, and one boy. This was the normalized culture that was seen as the norm of society. This is linked to the idea of cultural capital as mentioned by Bourdieu, that draws upon white privilege, white dominance, and privileged identity. The dominant culture that is embedded in the enacted and null curriculum is the white culture, as it is considered the most popular culture in society. The education system shaped my own cultural capital. I realized that because of my culture, I have certain life and survival skills that those of different cultures may not have because they were more privileged than I was. These include doing my own laundry, preparing my own meals, and participating in family-orientated gatherings. I remember when I was undertaking advanced English in my HSC, I wanted to compose my narrative essay around a story that embedded multiculturalism, including creative ideas around Arab, Asian, and indigenous cultures. However, I questioned this idea and resisted it the day me and my friends were conversing over lunch about our concern that I may get marked down if I'd done so. Now that I look back at this, I wonder if the enacted curriculum supposedly encouraged multiculturalism, how validated was this and why is there still a gap between cultures, races, indigenous people and the rest of the community? Why was I afraid to write about different cultures? Why did I believe that my marks would be affected if I did not put the focus on a westernized ideology? A major turning point for me would be my senior years in secondary schooling, where I came to the realization that the enacted curriculum was not enough. There was something more to it. Throughout my visual art unit in high school, we were always expected to draw upon the pop culture of the time. Even though the enacted curriculum encouraged students to draw upon their cultural backgrounds as an influence for their body of work, the hidden and null curriculum suggested otherwise, that we always needed to implement a touch of white culture in order to achieve better grades. We always knew that students from a supposedly higher economical private school that was located in the northern suburbs of Sydney would always be given higher grades, more equipment, accessibility, and a higher chance of achieving and having their body of work displayed in the art museum. These are some examples of my progress leading up to my body of work in visual arts HSC. I remember when I would come home from school, I would only feel comfortable speaking English with my family, and when they would communicate with me in Arabic, I would view this as something unacceptable and different in society. But I never really knew why. I never really understood the meaning of cultural assimilation and the fact that it was happening to me. I began to consider any sort of advertisement, artwork, movie, clothing, or song that was influenced by a culture other than the westernized culture as unsuccessful, and sadly now I know that this had something to do with the social perceptions of certain cultures and the influence this had on the null and hidden curriculum in the social institute of school. When looking at the sociological imagination, it is essential that I link my personal experiences with the larger world. Our world is somewhat already existing, and the values are already put into place for us. Our social backgrounds influence our attitude, behaviors, and life chances. School is considered as one of the social institutes in society that play an active role in constructing our identity. This social institute is invested in creating social regulation, normalization of culture, socialization, social stability, and formation of identity. When I reached university, I realized the amount of opportunities that were available to students, and a huge eye opener for me was that even though I grew up in a low socio-economical area and attended a university for my bachelor degree in the same area, I realized that particularly in tertiary education, the facilities, resources, and accessibility to a proper education were more equitable to all individuals despite their ethnic backgrounds or indigeneity. The education system and curriculum in my tertiary education up till now caters to all cultural groups and incorporates a great deal of Indigenous studies across its units. There have been many valuable units throughout my tertiary education that have allowed me to appreciate my own diversity and the diversity of others. I am now aware of the significance of culture in our community and have been exposed to explicit methods of catering for Indigenous students and their communities. I've been able to incorporate my own cultural background in most of my assessments throughout university without the feeling of shame or doubt. My true identity was beginning to unfold during this time and is continuing to do so. Mill's idea of the sociological imagination, which enables us to understand larger historical senses of the lives of individuals, brought to my attention that we grew up with a filter that was embedded in our education system. It was constructed to teach us to consider what was normal. The concept of deficit theory meant that teachers would associate success and failure with the individual's characteristics rather than how society positions them to succeed and fail. This theory has been embedded in both my primary and secondary schooling, which has taught me that schools must consider the student's cultural background, race, ethnicity, and if they come from an Indigenous background, in order to unfold the reason behind their behavior and also cater for their ways of learning. I remember back in secondary school, there was a student from an English Australian background in my year. She was the only student from this culture amongst a grade of mostly Middle Eastern, Asian, and African backgrounds. As teachers form their own ideology of social norms due to their schooling and social factors they grew up in, they may associate this student's white background and her level of academic performance, style of dress, speech, and level of care for education as higher than for a student of a Middle Eastern background. The term meritocracy, which falls under the critical social theory, is not considered valid because what you earn is not based on what you've put in. And if students do well at school, it is not based on their merits. Coming from a multicultural schooling, I realized that students come to school with different needs and influences. Hence, the idea of cultural hegemony is also well linked with this, as culture is something that resides within us and is shaped by what we like and what makes us comfortable. When a culture becomes hegemonic, in this case white culture, it becomes popular, common, dominant, and embedded in the curriculum of schooling. It became the core of our learning in school and what we were made to consider as the norm. I remember that even though multiculturalism was encouraged, we grew up with the idea that we must dress a certain way, speak a certain way, not to be out at this certain time of the day, which areas were considered safe or unsafe, which areas had high rates of criminal records or drug abuse. Let us watch a short snippet from a video on systemic racism by Jonathan Sri, which reflects this idea.
And some pop. Meanwhile, me watching her on TV, born here, raised here, never even occurred to me that my legitimacy as an Australian might be under question primarily because my skin isn't sufficiently susceptible to sunburn. I sharpened my pencil till the end snapped off, trying to triangulate home, but not quite sure where the satellites were, like a mobile phone. Bad reception, not lost, just disconnected. I'd imbibed society's subtle yet firm insistences that different equals wrong and brown. How else do you behave when the people of your birthplace treat you like an outsider? I trimmed my hair, secretly envied the small nose and thin lips of Caucasian classmates, kept sharpening that pencil. Dad was so busy trying to fit in, he didn't even teach me his language, and now, years later, I can only scavenge small morsels of vocabulary.
I'm sure we can relate to him in many ways. Foucault mentions the idea of dominant discourse, which shapes the norms and standards that people are expected to uphold in order to fit into a society. These norms and standards are produced and maintained through positions of power, and hence the process of normalization supports these dominant discourses. I remember growing up and learning a lot about the indigenous people of the land. It was embedded greatly in the enacted curriculum. However, in the now curriculum, it was evident that they made us consider Indigenous people as the other, their own community identity that did not blend in with the rest of society. And this became a dominant discourse. We were always made to believe that Indigenous students required extra support, facilities, and assistance. We were not taught how to act with Indigenous others in a way that did not make them feel different. We hardly heard of individual stories and experiences of Indigenous people. We mostly heard from a white person's perspectives on how they were undertaking a process of assimilation in order to form the society we are in now. During my Bachelor of Arts at Western Sydney University on the Parramatta River, we went for a walk to the river that was situated around the campus. This river was part of the Indigenous land and was home to many Indigenous civilians. We were given education on the importance of the land and who the owners were and what happened to them. This made me question why we were never taken on excursions similar to this. Why was Indigenous education theoretically based and not practical? In the enacted curriculum, we were taught that the Indigenous people were not treated as humans. White civilization took their rights away from them as well as their land. We were taught they were prohibited from belonging to the land, that they had to assimilate with the white culture. The now curriculum embedded the idea that white civilization is the reason behind today's Australian developed, modern, and successful society, in my opinion. Rahman, in her article Belonging and Learning to Belong in School, mentions that each child experiences schooling differently depending on what type of school they attended, their relationships with their teachers, peers, family, backgrounds, and skills. The hidden curriculum has obvious implications for participation in mainstream education by students because it requires students reconciling the behaviors akin to their cultural group and those deemed necessary for achieving success. Indirectly, as part of the hidden curriculum, we were expected to abandon our style of speech and instead conform to the correct language and culture. I felt that if children are to have any chance at succeeding, they must take on another identity, one that is aligned with the values and practices of the mainstream society. I believe there are still gaps between Indigenous and non-Indigenous student curriculum. We students learn things simply from going to school and not necessarily from what is being taught. The hidden curriculum, which is everything that is not academic but which has important influences on the academic outcomes, implements rules and behaviours that must be followed in accordance to the social norms. Indigenous students may not be able to conform to these westernized ways of behaving, but we must understand that this does not recognize them as not behaving or not being able to succeed in the real world. The ACRC group reaches out and caters for Indigenous students and their learning in many holistic ways. And here is a short snippet of what they do.
It's made me feel a lot more stronger about myself, like my own identity, who I am as a person, and reconnecting with my family and my ancestral heritage. I didn't have a great childhood. I had experience with drugs and alcohol when I was younger, so I can have empathy for them and know exactly what they're feeling. Some of the values that we instill is that we all belong, that no one's more important than each other, and patience, humility, and respect. One mistake or many mistakes that they've made doesn't define them, but they've got a chance to turn their lives around through that connection to country. At ACRC, it's like one giant family. At school, I was bullied, and being here is just the best. I love seeing the change. I love seeing them smile. I love seeing them express who they are. We predominantly go out to the schools because the program fits in within the school curriculum. I worked with a young person last year and he was teetering on the knife's edge of going into juvenile justice. He's got a welding apprenticeship now and he's not getting into any trouble.
Thank you very much for watching my autoethnography.